Good morning. It is Sunday morning, and we are in the ninth of the Hebrew month of Av. And I'm Rabbi Jessica Spitelnik-Mates from Temple Bethel of Boca Raton, not in Jerusalem, though I very much wish I could be in Jerusalem. But we are here, and we are welcoming you on many platforms. We have on Facebook Live, on our live stream, and some people with us in the Zoom as well. So wherever you are, we just want to say good morning. And we have a special journey that we are taking this morning for Tisha B'Av. Well, there are two unique things about this year's Tisha B'Av that I think are remarkable and important. One is that while normally it's a day where our eyes are focused on Jerusalem, while it is easier to be in Jerusalem this year for sure than it was last year, it's still not totally easy. Most of the world is not marking Tisha B'Av in Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem is not as full this summer as it would be in other summers. The other thing that I think is unique and special about this and only this Tisha B'Av that I kind of want to reflect on today is the Ezra element, which I'll talk about the book of Ezra and the biblical figure of Ezra in a little bit. If you think about where you were a year ago and where you sat last summer and what this summer looks like, they're different, but both these summers are different than any other before these past two summers in most of our lifetimes. And so in this summer, the second summer that we are going through the pandemic, what we are going to do is look at the background of Tisha B'Av with a very special person I'll introduce in a minute. And then we are going to look at the Book of Lamentations, the book that is traditionally read on this day, and where the events that mark Tisha B'Av are recounted. And then we're going to bring in Ezra. Why Ezra? Ezra is a biblical figure that talked about how the Jewish people go from the most destructive, saddest day to go forward and to live and to thrive. And I think we are right now in the summer of Ezra, where things are not completely like they were before COVID, but they're better than they were last summer. And we have to contemplate how to go forward. And it's not the same future that would have existed if there hadn't been a COVID. And there are things that we can learn from the biblical Ezra that help us in what I call this time of Ezra, this summer of Ezra. And those things are highlighted particularly on Tisha B'Av. And so we'll delve into all that today. It's a unique and special summer because we can't be in Jerusalem in the numbers that normally are there in the summer. And we just have a different outlook that the biblical Ezra can help us with. But before we start, some of you might not even know what Tisha B'Av is. And so we are very blessed that one of the kids who grew up at Temple Bethel, who's now a student at Tulane and thinking about rabbinical school is in her mind, is shadowing us this summer. And so her name is Rachel Ramos. She is the most spiritual person that you will ever meet. And she's a junior or going to senior year at Tulane?
Going to senior year.
Senior year at Tulane. And as part of shadowing us, she is watching what we do. And I put her a little bit to work this week to give you the background of Tisha B'Av, because sometimes when we talk about these holidays and these observances and the things we do, there's just basic information we sometimes have not known before or we forget. So I'm going to ask our awesome producer, Kira, who's behind the scenes helping us manage everything today, to spotlight Rachel. And she's going to give you, before we delve into our Summer of Ezra discussion, delve into a little bit of just Tisha B'Av. I think you called it Tisha B'Av 101.
Yeah.
Right, Rachel? So, Rachel, if you want to tell us anything more about yourself and then jump in to give us some of those basic facts about Tisha B'Av. And I see your mom's on and family friends as well. So good morning, Ramos family.
Told everyone about this. So I'm Rachel Ramos. As Rabbi Jessica said, I'm a senior at Tulane getting my bachelor's degree in Judaic Studies. And today I will be giving a little intro to what Tisha B'Av is. So, share my screen. What is Tisha B'Av? So, Tisha B'Av translates to directly mean the 9th day in the month of Av, the Hebrew month of Av, which typically falls during the summertime. It is the day that both the first and the second temples in Jerusalem were destroyed. And it's a holiday that marks sorrow and mourning and a lack of pleasure in one's life during this time. So many moons ago, in about 586 BCE, the king of Babylonia, King Nebuchadnezzar, invaded Jerusalem and destroyed the temple and forced the Israelites into exile in Babylon. And it wasn't for many long years before they were able to return to Israel and rebuild the temple. But then in 70 CE in Rome, the second temple was destroyed and the Jewish people were forced out into the diaspora for what they thought was going to be good until, the last 100 years.
Right. In Jerusalem by the Romans. Yes.
Yes.
That's
so since the destruction of the temples on the 9th of Av, more terrible things have happened on the state. The Jews were exiled from England and from Spain, 1492. World War I began in 1914. So lots of tragic events for the Jewish people, and even some tragic events worldwide have occurred on Tisha B'Av. And there are lots of different practices. Oh, how do I go back?
Your lower left. Your
There are lots of ways that we can observe the holiday. One of the main ways is to avoid things that cause joy or pleasure, which include eating, drinking, bathing, wearing perfume, reading the Torah, sexual intercourse, all of these things as we kind of fully immerse ourselves in the sadness of this day. People are also often encouraged to visit cemeteries to see loved ones. These are just some of the ways that Tisha B'Av is observed, as well as from reading the Book of Lamentations, which is, I think, where Rabbi Jessica is going to be taking over.
Exactly. Thank you, Rachel, so much for that background. And in modern times, I never saw this until I worked in the Jewish community in England before I went to rabbinical school. But in Finchley Reformed Synagogue in North London, the rabbi there at the time would literally turn the chairs over and drape the ark in black. So it looked like that own synagogue in England in the late 90s had been, the early 90s actually, I'm older than I'm attesting to, had been ransacked. And so when we came here, when I came here to Bethel, some years on Tisha B'Av, yes, great job, Rachel. Thank you, Phyllis, for pointing that out. So I would have the guys drape the ark in black and overturn some chairs here and there. So you take that ransacked feeling from the destruction of the first and second temple and you bring it to life. And that's the cusp that we sit on, because you might be fasting. Many people fast for Tisha B'Av, some don't. You might be fasting, you might not. But that's the world that we live in, that we live in multiple places, that we live in the tragedy that has befallen Jewish history again and again. And that's where Tisha B'Av firmly sits. And then we also figure out we're still here. We're going forward. Your day tomorrow, God willing, will not be as sad as today and is on the Jewish calendar. And so how do we go forward? This Ezra sentiment that we'll get to in a little bit. There's a lot of imagery that's related to Tisha B'Av that Kira gathered for us to look at. It is custom, as I said, to go to Jerusalem. I don't know what restrictions they have on size limits this summer, but last summer they certainly tried. It is custom to go to the Western Wall. If you know the city of Jerusalem, which is sitting behind me, what stands where the gold dome is once where the temple stood in Jerusalem. And so there's a feeling of sadness when you come to the Western Wall on Tisha B'Av, that is the place where the temple stood. It is not the goal of much of world Jewry, I can't say all of world Jewry, to rebuild the temple, but you come to that place of sadness. And if you've been to Jerusalem probably in the last 15 years or so and done the tunnel tours behind the temple, they actually bring you to the closest place to the Holy of Holies, but otherwise the Western Wall, where Jews traditionally pray, come. And on this day, normally it's a day bustling with prayer and beauty and life and bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs in certain areas, but on this day it is a sad day. This is a beautiful image that kind of depicts the ransacked nature of Tisha B'Av. If you see that big menorah, we're going to come back to that in a little bit. You just see the chaos and the smoke, the red that's at the center that just reminds you of the blood that was spilled on Tisha B'Av. And like any tragedy in Jewish history, the Jewish people had to figure out how to live after Tisha B'Av. And that's ultimately where Ezra will take us to, what we'll see in a little bit. But we still reflect and remember the day. And so you just see the chaos and the swirling and what someone imagined that the temple in Jerusalem looked like on this day. This is a depiction of the destruction of the second temple. You can tell from the style of clothes and that menorah, as I said, we'll get back to because it'll appear again on the Arch of Titus, and just the chaos and the woe and the sadness. And what is amazing about this piece and other pieces we'll see is like there's such a beauty. You know, you think of art as something that brings beauty and elevates, and yet how do you take the saddest moment and depict something so difficult and yet make it so physically beautiful at the same time? And that's really the world that we live in, that there's tragedy and difficulty, and how do we find the beauty that exists in it? So what is traditionally read on Tisha B'Av is the Book of Lamentations. It is said to have been written by Jeremiah. We've been looking at Jeremiah a lot. Jeremiah lives in this very much in between place where he experiences the exile to Babylon, and he also takes within his heart the hope that we will come back. But there is a lot of woe in Lamentations, this mourning of the city that stands alone. So what I want to do is just take you through a little bit of Lamentations through an excellent guide that's in Sefaria. Sefaria is a fantastic website that gathers all the Jewish texts. I highly encourage you to explore it on your own. And you just can see the blatantness of Lamentations, where the city sits alone. As Lamentation begins, they're talking about our beautiful Jerusalem and sadness and destruction, and the depth of the sorrow. When we look at the biblical character of Ezra in a little bit, we'll see and the sadness that is there, but still going forward from the sadness. And so the book literally takes the text and the historical event and combines them into one thing. So if you see here from Lamentations, the first chapter, her adversaries have come the head and her enemies are at ease. For God has afflicted her of the multitude of her sins. So in this beginning of Lamentations, everything is messed up and everything is turned upside down. Now, there's something significantly different about the two Tisha B'Avs that you may or may not be aware of. As Rachel taught us, the first destruction was in 586 BCE, but that was only a 70-year exile. And so the Jewish people were able to come back and build a second temple 70 years later. It was a so-so temple. It's the temple of the Hanukkah story and other periods of time. And then King Herod came along and built the second temple. And that's kind of the majestic temple that you see that's depicted in a lot of imagery. When you visit, you'll see Herodian stone around it. When the second temple was destroyed by Rome in the year 70, that was a nearly 2,000-year exile. Until there was a modern-day state of Israel, there was no Jewish homeland. And so you have mentally, think about like the impact of something that only lasts 70 years versus something that lasts 2,000 years. And that's the complexity of Tisha B'Av. There's a lot of space to fill with waiting for Jerusalem. And so when things get turned on your head, you know, for a minute or two, you might be willing to wait and see if they can turn back again. But all of a sudden it becomes 100 or 200 or 500 or 1,500 or 2,000 years. You cannot let things stay upside down on their head as they're depicted in Lamentations. And so over the years, the Jewish communities tried to correct themselves, and make things not be on their head. Even though there wasn't going to be a temple in Jerusalem anymore, they still tried to create what our synagogues are called, with Mikdash Me'at, which are smaller sanctuaries that we worship at individually, and there are synagogues all around the world for that reason. And so you can view Temple Bethel, or whatever synagogue that you are a part of, as part of the unturning the situation on its head. But the chaos of the initial moment is depicted here. Think of how you react when something unexpected happens, and the chaos that exists for that moment, and ultimately you need to find calm and figure out how to right the situation. But this is the chaos of that moment that's there. You also see the personification of the people of Israel who want to have peace and who plead for mercy. And what's painful about this text that's written about 2,600 years ago is we will know again and again the sentiment that is here. Behold, God, I am in distress. My innards burn. My heart is turned within me, for I have grievously rebelled. In the street sword bereaves. It is like a house of death. This has happened again and again to our people. And what is powerful and painful about Tisha B'Av is many of the events that cause us this intense grief, this innards burning grief, happen on Tisha B'Av all the way till modern times that are there. There's some anthropomorphism that exists in biblical texts, including Lamentations, that you'll see here. The God has purposed to destroy the wall of the daughter of Zion. He stretched out the line, not withdrawn God's hand from destroying it, but made the rampart and the wall to mourn. They languish together. This is the intensity. First of all, biblical text. Biblical text is able to convey an intensity that is just magnificent and powerful and painful. Look at the intensity of the mourning, that it goes all the way to the physical objects. Not just people are mourning, everything is mourning. It's groaning. And years later, Rav Kook, the first chief rabbi of the modern day state of Israel, will write an emotional poem about the wall, the Western Wall, and he will give it heart instead of pain and mourning. He will give it heart, because there is now a modern day state of Israel. And so the intensity of Tisha B'Av is supposed to stretch everywhere, not just in the actions that you do, but that everything mourns that is there. The other thing that losing the temple does for the destruction of the first and the second temple, is it takes away our magnetic north. It takes away our pole. When we face to pray, when we need to face, what do we face? Jerusalem, no matter where we are in the world. With the destruction of temple, we've lost our orientation. What will happen over the centuries, of course, as we learn, is when we turn things right again and try and take the disarray of Tisha B'Av and right it again, is we go back to facing Jerusalem, even if the temple doesn't stand there. The Dome of the Rock stands there today, and yet that's still the site that we face, that is there. And so throughout the Book of Lamentations, you have this incredible imagery that shows us the sadness and the difficulty of the day. I want you to think over the last year and a half, what has been the sadness and difficulty that you have experienced over the last year and a half, and your darkest day or your most difficult day. And unfortunately, all of us have had one where either we lost someone or we experienced something that was difficult and painful. And Tisha B'Av is supposed to harness that sadness, like Rachel taught us. Traditionally, people go to the cemetery on this day to sit and be with those we have loved. But what I wanted to do today, in this unique position that we are in, excuse me, is to look at Ezra and figure out how we can harness what Ezra taught us when he reacted to the destruction of the temple, and figure out how we can harness that in our modern day, this unique and special time that we have lived through, this moment like no other. So Ezra lived about 480 to 440 BCE. He is someone who helped make sure that Torah reading would continue and be revived once the exiles returned to Jerusalem. He was part of the exiles that had been banished to Babylonia after the first Tisha B'Av and the destruction of the first temple. And he didn't just come back. He came back with his eye on the future. If you think about like a Jeff Bezos or Richard Branson, just because they're in the news so much, these are people who don't just do things that are focused on this minute or this hour or this day. They do things that are future focused. That is very much the sentiment of Ezra. He was perhaps the Jeff Bezos or the Richard Branson of his time. He was so future focused. He was a little bit of extreme. He definitely had like zealot qualities about him, conservative qualities about him. He railed against many things in Judaism that we would tolerate today. But the most important thing that Ezra did is he let himself mourn. And you see these two depictions of him. You see the mourning Ezra, because you are going to mourn the destruction of the temple, and you're going to take that mourning. They made an intentional decision. We are going to remember this destruction and carry it forward. But then he said, we are going to bring back the Torah to the people. He instituted Torah reading not just on Shabbat, but on market days as well. And he brought Judaism to the future. There are things that Ezra did that we carry out to this very day. And Ezra is the one who figured out to live. So you have a decision when there is difficulty. You have a decision when there is something as tragic and massive that happens as Tisha B'Av again and again throughout Jewish history where there is destruction. You have decision to give up and say, I'm done, it's over, or you have a decision to go forward. And not just go forward, but thrive. And Ezra was a thriver. He said, we are going to figure out how to thrive as a people. And I can't think of something that is more powerful than that sentiment as we live in this time. We have to be changed by this year and a half. We can't be not changed. We were just talking about this the other day. This year ahead is not like back to normal from before. This is hybrid year. This is a year where we're going to figure out how to engage people who are both at home and who choose to walk in the sanctuary, how to engage and bring the intensity and the energy and the beauty of all that is Judaism in a way that both penetrates the screen and also remains alive and powerful in person. And Ezra would have been perfect in this time and this place because he would have figured out how to take the memory of what had happened in the past, the tragedy and the difficulty, and infuse it going forward in a way that marks it and makes it, bring it very deeply into our hearts, but also goes forward. For this, for the greatness of Ezra, and I want to just share a couple of Ezra's texts before we look at this amazing praise of Ezra that exists. I want to just share with you a little bit of the book of Ezra so that you can see how honored and how appreciated this biblical Ezra is. So he is living at this time where the Jewish, it's funny, Judaism understands it's physically not totally possible, but Judaism understands Ezra as the one who kind of decided the canon of Jewish tradition. And there's imaginings, there's midrash that imagine, because the last book that to go into the canon was the Book of Esther, which talks about, of course, the story of Purim we talk about, and it's really the like time-wise, chronologically, the last book that takes place. And there's imaginations of Esther, literally the biblical Esther, pleading with Ezra to be allowed into the canon. Like that's how powerful that he was. He was going to decide the Jewish text that would ultimately become the Tanakh that was there. So it's funny to think of like Esther pleading her case and saying like, put me in the canon, make sure that I'm there. So here's a little bit from the book of Ezra, just so you get the context of his of him as a biblical character. He's mostly concentrated in the book of Ezra chapter 7, which is in the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible. And we see here, Ezra came up from Babylon, a scribe expert in the teaching of Moses. And that will be a clue how important Moses is, that his name is mentioned in the same breath as Moses, which God of Israel had given, whose request the king had granted in its entirety, thanks to the Lord towards him. Ezra dedicated himself to the study of teaching of the Lord, so to observe it and teach its laws and rules to Israel. So Ezra was going to make sure that Torah was going to be kept alive and applied to your life. And he was going to make sure that we went back to Jerusalem, and he was going to be given power like Moses, right? Moses has the same power to appoint magistrates, because we're going to have to figure out how to live amongst people who are in the world at large. And that will be the conundrum of the destruction after the first temple and the second temple and the Holocaust and the Spanish Inquisition and all the things that have been fallen Jewish history to this very time, is how do we keep Judaism alive while at the same time making sure that we still keep good relations with our neighbors who are Jewish and non-Jewish as well. We are not going to live anymore like Moses did, traveling through the desert with the Jewish people, where you're able to do everything that's uniquely Jewish. It's a matter of figuring out how to keep Judaism alive in the world at large. There will be great failures at this, as we'll see. We'll talk about a little bit after the destruction of the second temple. But you see here in this very powerful statement in the Talmud that it is taught that Ezra, as you saw in its context, was suitable for the Torah to be given to him for the Jewish people had Moses not come first and received the Torah already. So that's how important Ezra is. And I think that's something for us to remember, that there is a Moses that is inside each and every one of us, that when we handle something, not just recovering and dealing with it, but being so future focused, we can harness our inner Ezra. And I think that's the unique power and beauty of this moment in time. What's the Ezra of this moment? What do you need to take from the tragedy and difficulty of the year and a half going forward? How do you need to view the world in a way that makes you a modern day Moses, that makes you a modern day Ezra, where you're able to take and synthesize what has happened so that you are elevated to this status as Ezra is. With regard to Moses, as we go back to the Sanhedrin text, the verse states Moses went up to God. And with regard to Ezra, the verse states Ezra went up from Babylon, and he was a ready scribe in the Torah of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given, which we just read. And think about it. Ezra gets good to go into the land of Israel, something that Moses did not ever get to do. Just as the text continues here, just as the going up stated here with regard to Moses is for the Torah, which he received from God and transmitted to the Jewish people, so too the going up stated there with regard to Ezra is for the Torah, as he taught the Torah to the Jewish people and was suitable to have originally merited to give it. The Braita continues with regard to Moses. The verse states, and the Lord commanded me at that time to teach you statutes and ordinances. And with regard to Ezra, the verse states, for Ezra had set his heart to seek the Torah of the Lord his God, and to do it and to teach in Israel statutes and ordinances. And even though the Torah was not literally given to him, the script of Torah was changed by him. And so Ezra is living at this time where the first temple is destroyed, Solomon's temple that had been built in about the year 960 BCE, before the year 0, destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And he took the essence of the temple, that which was to centralize worship and to make sure the Jewish people followed the commandments that were in the Torah, and he brought it alive. He did it by making sure there was public reading of Torah, so people couldn't say, oh, I don't have access to it, so I don't really know what's going on. And he was really, really strict. It was kind of if you think of the way a pendulum swings, in the same way at the beginning days of COVID, like we had to be so strict. Think of how many how many, I see Margaret on the Zoom. I remember seeing Margaret at the supermarket. I didn't want to scare her. There were so many layers we were all wearing at the supermarket, and gloves and things. And I think they said gloves ultimately weren't effective, and 2 masks and hoodies and all these things. We had to be so strict. That was Ezra. That in reaction to the tragedy, he was so strict with the Jewish people. That's why some people aren't crazy about him, but he was so strict about Judaism because he felt if he wasn't, that people would get too lax. And that's why he's elevated to the status of Moses. And again, this fantastic imagery that Kira has found for us to look at. The second temple will be the epitome of the place where we will see the scattering of the Jewish people and how Judaism can die if you don't have people in the sentiment of Ezra, and how Judaism can thrive to this very day if you do. So this is depiction on the left side of the screen of what the second temple looked like. This is really the second temple. The second temple that was built 70 years after the Babylonian exile was kind of like a puny lame temple, they think. That's the temple of the Hanukkah story. The historical character of Herod came along and built the second temple. I won't get too much into Herod. Just know that he was a master architect. Herod really lived in between 2 worlds, and he was just crazy for it. He was very paranoid, had very extreme behavior. He built Masada, he built the aqueducts at Caesarea, and he built the second temple, of which the Western Wall is a remnant. He was famous for his framed stone, the Herodian stone, with the stones that have frames around them. Herod was a confused figure for a very real historical reason. Judaism is not a proselytizing religion. There's only one sect in time that Judaism was proselytizing that forcibly converted people to Judaism, and that was the Zealots. So Herod's great-great-grandfather was forcibly converted by the Zealots. So on that side, he was part of converted people. And then on his wife's side, he married Mariami. He was part of the Hasmoneans, who were the descendants of the Maccabees. And so she really was like more rightful heir than he was. And so he had a lot of paranoia. He pickled her in honey and buried her in a tower, and his brother-in-law. He had like a lot of palace intrigue that he created. But one of the master architectural feats he did was build the second temple. It's said to be as large as 12 football fields. If we were here in person, I would take 2 people and have you roll on the ground and show you how the Herodian stone was moved to Jerusalem. They had, like, if you imagine 2 large, almost telephone pole size pieces of lumber, and they would roll the stone to the temple site and build this massive second temple. The Western Wall exists. So I don't know if you can see my my pointer or not, but the Western Wall is a remnant of here. And if you've ever been to the Southern Steps, they are here on this side. It's just a majestic. Just a majestic site. There's a great model of the second temple. It used to be the Holy Land Hotel. I'm not sure where it is today. So when the second temple was destroyed by this tension that existed between Rome and the Jewish people, there were 4 sects of Judaism. There were the Sadducees, who were the greatest assimilators. They were the wealthy class. They fell in love with the Hellenistic life, Greek and then Roman life, and they just completely assimilated. So if you know someone who's maybe part of the Jewish people and then just completely assimilates and doesn't remain part of the Jewish people anymore, that's your Sadducees. You have the Zealots, as I talked about. They forcibly converted to Jewish people. That's the group that ultimately went to Masada and died in suicide at Masada rather than giving into Rome a couple of years after the destruction of the second temple. They fought refuge there. You have the Essenes, which is the Dead Sea sect. They went also into the desert. They didn't procreate, and they led the life of a hermit. And if you don't procreate, you can't continue on Judaism. And so the only sect that thrives till this, that we may or be the descendants are the Pharisees, who said, we need to figure out how to keep Judaism alive even after Rome has destroyed the second temple. That's the spirit of Ezra. How do you keep Judaism alive? So what happens is the second temple is destroyed. And remember the menorah that we saw depicted? If you've been to Rome, you've seen what is known as the Arch of Titus, which celebrates our destruction. It celebrates the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. And the Arch of Titus depicts all the temple wares that were taken to Jerusalem. It is ironic when you go to the Arch of Titus and look at it, that the Jewish people are alive and well, and look at this monument that depicts their destruction, and there is no more Roman people that exist. There's a Rome, and there's Italy, and there's Italian people, but the Roman people that existed that led to the destruction of the temple no longer exist. As Jews are apt to do, we don't blame the history for our destruction. We blame ourselves, right? The way that things went at the time, you have Rome and Jerusalem in tension, and you have Vespasian, who is the exarch, and his son is Titus. And in this midrashic story that's told that kind of blames us for the destruction of the Second Temple, you have a party where two people come to a party. We just studied this in Torah study 2 weeks ago. You have someone who's giving a party and someone who's invited to a party, and a man named Bar Kamsa. He is invited to the party by mistake. Kamsa was supposed to be invited to the party, and instead Bar Kamsa got invited. The host hated Bar Kamsa, asked him to leave. Bar Kamsa said, let's keep the peace and just let me stay. I'll pay for myself. I'll pay for half the party. He's negotiating with the host to let him stay and not humiliate him. Finally, he says, I'll pay for the whole party. The host continues to humiliate him, asks him to leave, and through a series of events, goes to report to Rome what is going on and that there's a rebellion plan, tells an untrue thing. And a sacrifice is sent by Rome to prove whether the Jewish people are planning a rebellion or not. And what Bar Kamsa does is he nicks the sacrifice in a way that it will make it not kosher for a Jewish sacrifice, but okay for a Roman sacrifice. And so because of this nick, the Jewish people refused to sacrifice the Roman animal. And that act of hate, of sinat chinam, of baseless hatred, is said to lead to the destruction of the Second Temple. It's not, Margaret, go ahead. I'm going to ask you to unmute. You have to unmute. Yeah.
You know, I always have a problem with that type of thing, that we've brought it on ourselves. And God, all of the things, the Holocaust, why, God, this, that. I just think things happen, or for whatever reason, or there was an enemy. But to think that these men, because they had this rivalry and this argument and this dinner, and they had this issue that they had, was the cause of the destruction. I just find it, it's not something that I can
resonate with.
I can,
yeah.
yeah.
So it's like facets on a, right. So it's like facets on a diamond where there's just complexity. And I think that the part of that story, first of all, if you don't look at in the mirror, like, you can't be a citizen of the world at large. You do have to examine your behavior and what is going on with the Jewish people. And that's what the story does. I think it says whatever situation you are in, you have to have accountability for what's going on. It's not the only reason, because ultimately what you have is Titus, who is Vespasian's son, is the one who attacks Jerusalem and brings these temple wares back to Rome. So there are historical reasons as well. But I think it's a really humble and beautiful way to go through life and say, what can I do? Again, like back to the point I'm making, Ezra said, if my behavior contributes to the destruction of the first temple, or my ancestors' behavior, what can I do? Because you can contribute to the destruction as well as you can contribute to the paving the pathway for the future. And I think if you only look at, yes, you can drive yourself nuts if you only look at the negative and how did I contribute to the negative and the destruction. But you don't only have to do that. You can look and say, how can I contribute to a better future? And I think that's the spirit of Ezra that I'm trying to accentuate here on this day of Tisha B'Av, that he sat in the space of like this is bad, and we have to tighten our red lines and make sure we do certain things. But we also can contribute to the spirit of continuing the Jewish people. So it's not only looking at, it's a great point you make, Margaret, but it's not only looking at when we contribute to the destruction, but also when we contribute to the future and to the rebuilding as well. I don't know if that helps or not, but we wouldn't be Jews if we didn't self-reflect. The Israeli army is the toughest critic of itself. There's no tougher critic of the Israeli army than the Israeli army in itself. And I think that's a really important way to live life. It is so easy to blame others for things that we have caused. And once we can do that, we can blame ourselves, but then we can also figure out how to change the script and go forward and make it better. So you have this Arch of Titus that depicts this moment of destruction. And this will not be a 70-year exile like Ezra experienced. This is going to be a 2,000-year exile. You're sitting here watching this, which means there was success. We did figure out how to recalibrate and how to go forward. But it was not without tragedy. And what is remarkable is again and again throughout Jewish history, we had to go back to that pain of Tisha B'Av, not just mark it as we do on the day in good times, but experience it. And as Rachel taught us earlier, the expulsion of Jews from Spain, which Kira has these incredible depictions of, there are events that said to happen. Again, not everything happened in one day. Like these are major destructions, but Tisha B'Av is often the catalyst, right? Like where it starts and it goes forward from this day, or something intensely horrible happens on that day. I think I saw something, actually, I should have verified this before. I think John Lewis may have, like the Jewish date of his death, it may be Tisha B'Av as well. I'm not 100% sure, so don't hold me to that, but I think I saw somebody share that as well. Someone can look that up if they want to check that. Here you have the Jewish community doing what Ezra is doing, is figuring out how a way to go forward, right? And if they're not going to be able to stay in Spain, at least figure out a way how to thrive, how to go forward. Again, like facets on a diamond, that did not happen in one just way. You have people like the Marranos, who were hidden Jews, who adopted the religion of the place, but went into the closet and lit candles. And you have families that 500 years later had strange customs where grandma would go into the closet and light candles. And I don't know if you know this, but if you have Spanish ancestry, you can actually become a Spanish citizen and a member of the EU. If you have children or grandchildren who are under 18, there's a certain process you have to go through. But people want their children to be part of the EU so they can work anywhere in Europe. So if you have ancestry that goes back and you can prove it, then if your children are under 18, they can actually, through a process, become Spanish citizens if there was Spanish Jewish history. And if you're over 18, it's a much harder process. I think there's tests and things that you have to do. As Rachel shared with us, Germany enters World War I on Tisha B'Av, and we know the destruction of World War I that will happen. We also will know, of course, that after World War I, that what happens in Germany ultimately creates the situation that leads to World War II. And it is said that the final solution was approved on Tisha B'Av in 1941. So if you remember the first couple of years of the Holocaust, there was shooting, and that was the way that they were killing people. And this sick Nazi way of viewing it as inefficient, they wanted to figure out a final solution rather than displacing the Jews or shooting them one by one. And that's when gassing came in, when you could kill so many more people as one. So that, again, is that painful Tisha B'Av. The Warsaw Ghetto there was a mass deportation from the Warsaw Ghetto. It was liquidated on Passover, but on Tisha B'Av, there was one of the large mass deportations that was there that happened as well. And so how do we grapple with this day? And if we are going to be like Ezra with a year and a half plus of pandemic under our belts, where we know what we've learned over the last year and a half, how do we go forward? How do we look at this difficult day and figure out what it means to us? One of the ways that people do that is through art, the art that you've seen throughout this PowerPoint that Kira gathered. Art is beautiful, and art makes our souls move. And so the fact that an artist, an artist has a choice to depict whatever they want, unless they have a great benefactor and they're paid to depict something in particular. An artist is able to depict what their heart moves them. So why is it that artists choose to depict Tisha B'Av? I think it's because it's a way of taking the tragedy and the difficulty of the day and doing the very same thing that Ezra did, which is figuring out how you go forward. That even in the ugliest of circumstances, this repetitive tragedy day in Jewish history, that you create beauty. And I love this this piece of the three women studying Lamentations that's here. And I love the candle at the center, the way the image is depicted. You see kind of on the, there's like a fuzziness, especially with the woman on the right. It's not quite clear. It's almost like the way you would see an image if you had tears in your eyes, which is what Tisha B'Av is really supposed to move you to tears, to such intense sadness. And yet the thing that's depicted most vividly and what your eye is directed to is the candlelight, right? If you have like even one little bit of a spark of hope inside of you, like you can figure out how to go forward even from Tisha B'Av. And I think it's just very moving that these artists choose to depict this holiday in all these different ways, that they don't ignore the ugly of history. So how do we find hope on Tisha B'Av? How do we find the ability to go forward? How do we find the ability to pray? And you have this juxtaposition here of Auschwitz and someone with an Israeli flag. You have the Western Wall and that beautiful Herodian stone that I talked about that's there. How do we figure out a way to go forward? So I shared this story Friday night, but I'll share it again with you here. On NPR the other day, they talked about this young woman who, let me just share this slide with you, who has been, who lost her father and an uncle and several other relatives in the Surfside tragedy. And the mayor of Miami Beach had seen her sitting there, and he was like, what do I say to this 12-year-old? Like, why is she sitting here and pulling at her phone and saying psalms and things like that? And Biden went over to meet her. When he visited the site, the mayor met her, and the mayor asked her, what are you doing at the site? And she goes, this is the closest I can get to the place where my father died. And so I'm saying prayers here at this place. And the fact that this 12-year-old girl has the ability to pray, that's what Ezra's about. That we are still alive and we are still here, and we take these moments of difficulty and pain and tragedy, whether they are personal or whether they are part of our history or part of our world history, and we figure out how to keep praying and how we go forward, and to sit in rubble, whether it's rubble of 2,000 years ago or 2,500 years ago, or whether it's rubble of 80 years ago, or whether it's rubble of just a few short weeks ago. The ability to find prayer inside of ourselves and to have a tradition that gives us so many beautiful things to pray is really powerful. And that's what Ezra said to do. You just need to figure out how to go forward. Don't forget the destruction, but figure out how to go forward. And so I want to share with you this reading about the nature of Tisha B'Av, which really reflects that message that is here. This is the nature of Tisha. I'm just trying to figure out how to move my bar. Here we go. The Nature of Tisha B'Av by Mori Gren-Banau. There's no question that there is an element of the feeling of despair on Tisha B'Av. However, I do not believe that it is the defining factor in saying Tachanun, which are like supplications, like just prayers of sadness, of forgiveness. on Tisha B'Av, since the Jewish response is never one of depression and hopelessness. Think about that. The Jewish response is never one of depression and hopelessness. That's the epitome of our Ezra, the summer of Ezra that we have. It is interesting to note that we also do not say Tachanun, which are these prayers of sadness and forgiveness on Erev Tisha B'Av. If the reason was simply that it was a time when we felt distance with God, then it would be difficult to understand why we did not say Tachanun before Tisha B'Av as well. This time the Shulchan Aruch gives us a reason. He explains that Tisha B'Av is called Moed in the first chapter of Lamentations. Although the simple reading of the verse would seem to indicate that Moed means time, or like an in-between time, the implication is on some level that there is a holiday aspect of Tisha B'Av. How can we understand Tisha B'Av as a celebration of any kind? The Jewish response to tragedy is certainly to mourn, but it is also, let me just move you, to move on and find the light contained within the darkness. There is debate as to whether Kiddush HaLevana, the blessing of the new moon, should done on the night after Tisha B'Av, or should wait to right after Shabbos Nachamu, the Shabbat of comfort, when we normally say Kiddush Levana. It is generally said on Saturday night. The Ari felt that it should be said immediately after the fast for Tisha B'Av. Due to the fact that the Messiah is born on Tisha B'Av, we announce to the world that the moon will be renewed in recognition of this fact. The idea that is that in our darkest hour, the seeds of our greatest redemption are born. Even on the saddest day of the Jewish calendar, we refrain from saying Tachanun. The message is for us to find a message of hope for a brighter future, even in the most challenging and troubling of times. And so what I want to share with you as we mark Tisha B'Av, and Tisha B'Av consumes the summer in terms of like the Haftarot that are read, the readings from the prophets that are read on Shabbat in this time are all things that help us process Tisha B'Av. So Tisha B'Av does not stand as a day alone. There's leading up to Tisha B'Av to prepare for the day and its morning, and then these portions of comfort that are supposed to comfort after. It is supposed to penetrate so deeply. So Kira brought me a poem a few days ago that I'll share with you in a second that I wanted to end with. But in our modern expression, if we're supposed to figure out how to find the summer of Ezra inside of us, even when it's winter, this is a quote that when Kira brought me this poem that I'll share with you in a moment, that I had that I'd written down years and years ago. And the quote is from Camus, and it says, "In the midst of winter, I found there was within me invincible summer." Now, we live in Florida, so we have summer all year round, so it may not resonate. But if you think about winter in terms of like the metaphor and the dying and the hibernation that happens, I had written this quote, this first part, years ago. And when Kira gave me this poem we'll look at in a moment, it reminded me of that quote, but it goes on, and this is beautiful. I'd never seen this part originally. "And that makes me happy, for it says that no matter how hard the world pushes against me, within me there is something stronger, something better pushing right back. That's what Ezra knew thousands of years ago, but that is what you know from living through this pandemic, is that no matter how hard the world pushes against us, there is something in us stronger pushing back." And so what I want to do to close with is share this beautiful piece, and feel free to read it out loud at home as well. It is something beautiful that reflects this. So please feel free to join me if you are able to, whatever place you are watching. "Deep inside the winter, you'll find you still have summer. Deep inside the sadness, you'll find you have some joy. Deep inside the night, you'll find you still have morning. Deep inside the anger, you'll find a way to forgive. Deep inside the fear, you'll find you still have courage. Deep inside the silence, you'll find again your voice. Deep inside the iceberg, you'll find your fire burning, and deep inside the clouds, you'll find the blue-white flag." And it's just a powerful. Do you want me to keep it up, Margaret, so you can take a picture of it, or you got it? you just find the power and majesty of the day. If you want to take a picture of that screen, I'll also go to the previous screen because I think the Camus quote is just as fantastic. In the midst of winter, I found there was within me an invincible summer, and that makes me happy. For it says, no matter how hard the world pushes against me, within me, there's something stronger, something better, pushing right back. And it's just what we need to remember. There is something inside of us that is stronger, that pushes back, that even on the saddest day of the Jewish calendar, that we are able to find an iota of that candle flame, an iota of hope, an iota of figuring out how to go forward. And what is beautiful about our Jewish tradition is we don't leave the past in the past, that we don't let the sadness sit in its time and its place. We figure out how to grapple with that sadness, and it helps us to deal with our own modern sadness as we go forward. We just have a few minutes. I'm going to open it up if anyone has any comments or questions. We're not able to monitor any of the other streams, but if you're on the Zoom and if anything you want to share or say before we conclude, I'm just going to open it up. If anyone has anything.
I appreciate your comments on that we do have things that we do that I think what we need to have is introspection. I think what you taught us, that all these terrible things that happen, we can't just moan and groan about them, but that we can look to see how we can improve and get on with things and do better.
Mm-hmm. And don't hoard that, right? Like Ezra had enough wherewithal to know, like, Judaism needed to be carried on, but he didn't hoard that. He figured that out internally. He found the summer inside of himself, but then he said, I'm going to do the opposite of the internal work, and I'm going to go externally. I'm going to make incredibly intense, serious laws for the Jewish people and make sure they're carried out. But the most beautiful thing that he did is instituted this public reading of Torah, so that he made it there for the world at large. And I think that's what we have to kind of figure out as we synthesize this time, how we can be like Ezra, where we like sit and reflect. And Tisha B'Av is definitely a day to sit in sadness and reflect. It's commendable not to work. You can work, but it said, like, there's quotes like, your work accomplishes nothing on Tisha B'Av. Like, there's, it's of no good on Tisha B'Av, but you are allowed to work. But if we take that great pause that Tisha B'Av was, thank you for all your kind comments. The art was found by Kira and it's beautiful. Thanks, Carol and Hank. It's great to see you, and Phyllis and everyone. That you take this great pause, which is what Tisha B'Av. I think we're really lucky on our Jewish calendar, and I'm really glad it's on Sunday this year, because I think that Sunday's just a less chaotic day, and I think we need that reflection time and that calm to kind of reflect. Okay, we're in this in between place where we're not like fully back, but we're back a lot more than we were a year ago. How do we take this day that marks tragedy and gives us a lot of lessons out of the tragedy and synthesize, like Ezra, to first work on ourselves and find that internal building up, that and then move from that internal blame to also finding internal hope for the future, and then bring it to the world at large. And I think, like, what I've certainly learned from the last year, like, I love Temple Bethel tremendously, like, because we have kids like Rachel. Like, this is a place that gets to watch kids like Rachel grow up and dream big and do amazing things, and feel so lucky. But I feel like in being shuttered home during the pandemic almost drew us closer together, even though we were apart from each other physically. Like, we drew closer in a way that Judaism always wanted us to, but the busyness of this and modern and everything that pulls at us didn't always let us. And like, just in that quiet time of this, like, it drew us closer. So it's almost like we go forward better in the same way, like Ezra's elevated to Moses. Like, we can be that too. We can go forward better, even in the face of the most difficult tragedy. And I think it's just a very powerful, beautiful thing. Rachel, did you want to say something?
No, I don't think I have anything to add.
Okay. I saw you were unmuted. I want to thank you for your opening. You gave us the great reminders we need about this day and why it's so important. I want to thank everyone who joined us on all our platforms for being with us for Tisha B'Av. I want to thank Kira for assembling just this beautiful slideshow of these incredible images, and Isabella, who adds our Temple Bethel look to it and our graphics. And just thank everyone for being with us. If you are fasting, just wish you a meaningful fast on this day of Tisha B'Av. And I look forward to all of us being our modern day Ezras and figuring out how to go